Over to you, Ian.
Thank you. Hi, everyone, and welcome to another ANZCCJ webinar, reflecting on the Tokyo 2020 Paralympic Games. My name is Ian Scott, Executive Committee Member of the ANZCCJ and Co-Chair of the Sports for Business Committee. After a one-year postponement and 2 weeks of incredible competition between the top athletes around the world, the Tokyo Paralympics Games was an incredible success for the Paralympic movement. Notwithstanding the trying conditions surrounding the COVID-19 restrictions that were in place in Japan during the pandemic. This required amazing cooperation and teamwork between everyone involved. Especially, we must thank the Japanese government and the Tokyo Paralympic Committee that enabled us to watch the incredible feats by Australian and New Zealand athletes, which brought all of us enormous joy for those of us who were able to watch this spectacle on TV. I can assure you, I watched most of the events online with our very own Channel 7, which was absolutely amazing. To our special guests and the people speaking today, Lynn Anderson was appointed as CEO of Australian Paralympics in 2015 and a very, very passionate person about the development of the Paralympic movement with over 30 years experience in the sports sector, working with sponsors, variety of sports, and the Australian government. She also set up her own company in the sponsorship research industry. I think it's called ESCOM in Australia and New Zealand. And Lynn is still currently chair of the Canterbury Bulldogs Rugby League Club. Fiona Allan is currently CEO of Paralympics New Zealand and also a passionate advocate to parasports both nationally and internationally. Fiona is a member of the International Paralympic Committee Women in Sports Committee, a member of the International Olympic Committee Channel Commission, a global member of the International Working Group Women in Sport, an executive member of the Carbine Club in New Zealand, and Fiona was awarded an Officer of the New Zealand Order of Merit in 2018 for her work as a champion of Paralympic sport in New Zealand. So, on behalf of the ANZCCJ and the Sports for Business Committee, we are honoured to welcome both Lynn and Fiona to share their perspectives on the success and I'm sure the challenges of the Tokyo 2020 Paralympic Games. Just one point as if you have any questions, please use the chat tool or send an email to Emily. We'll do our best to try and answer all your questions within the hour we have designated. And for our mediator today will be Peter Gibson. Over to you, Peter.
Thank you, Ian, and thank you everybody for joining us today. May I just say what an incredible honour and privilege it is actually just to mediate our second CEO's webinar. We did one before the Games, which was a tremendous success. And following on from that one, we thought we'd have a around the table review. For me personally, to be a part of the Paralympic team as executive advisor in the time in Tokyo was a little bit more of a dream come true than anything else. Those of you who know me, Japan is my second home, has been so for 36 years. And it really was one of those moments each day that I had to pinch myself that I was actually part of this incredible event with 6,000 people in the village. And all of us who were able-bodied were actually in the vast minority of people in that village. So it was certainly something. The emotions in the first couple of days were amazing. So thanks, Ian, for that. And I'll leave it to the CEOs to give you a little bit more of an insight into how special these games were and how different they were. I finished up my time with Paralympics and the Australian Olympic Committee and had time to reflect and, just giving a bit of time. It's almost, how do we actually explain and put into words what it was like to be there? I did a webinar last night with the Australia-Japan Society, and I took quite a few notes from that, and I hope we can actually relay that through to people today. But Lynn and Fiona, thank you so much for joining us again. I know it's been one hell of a roller coaster ride, and we feel like we've almost, as you were just saying before, you feel like you've come off this roller coaster of Tokyo, etc. And then somebody sits down, they want to talk to you about Beijing 2022 and Paris 2024. And stop the world. I just want to get off. So I'd like to get a little bit of an insight first of all. Lynn, can I start with you? We sat there that day. We were the only ones in the Olympic Stadium on the last day of competition. And Madison de Rosario, who we thought never had a chance in that Olympic gold medal marathon. Louise Savage had said that if she conquered that last hill about 3 kilometres away from the stadium, she was going to get it. And I was standing next to you and we were both looking at each other and going, why have they got the victory banner out? I think she's going to win this. Lynn, there was so much happened. How do you encapsulate your period at the Paralympics and being there?
Oh, look, so much is certainly doesn't even begin to cover it. I think in terms of that moment with Maddie, that was really special. You know, Maddie is one of the athletes I have worked with more than others, and she's been on an amazing journey where it's been a privilege to actually watch her find her voice, I say. Not all the athletes need to be a role model, not all of them want to be, and for a long while Maddie didn't, but Maddie has not only made her mind up, but when you hear her speak now, I remember turning around to her coach, Lou Savard, who is a legend in Australia, and saying, where did that come from? The first time I heard her use this beautiful advocacy voice. So for me, it was special just to be there with her and see her do, which really was quite impossible, you know, to have it left in, as you said, she remembered going on that tour with you, Pete, the recce the day before, where Lou said, this is where it'll be one I lost. And so she said she went up there, but then for the next 3Ks thought, have I gone too soon? So went through all the emotions of heartbreak, but to be there that day was pretty special. The games themselves, and I'm sure Fiona will have the same words, they were just profound. So profound that I think you've got to stop. And even now, I'm still getting goosebumps, and I still can't really necessarily be sure that I've actually captured everything that they did and meant for us. From our point in Australia, and I won't go into it now, I'll probably use it later, but the impact at home was amazing, aided and abetted by a COVID lockdown audience. But, you know, it really has been a step change for us, these games, in terms of the Australian Paralympic movement and our athletes at home. And to have actually been a part of that is incredible. The other bit that I'm extra proud of too is our team. And when I say our team, our Paralympic HQ team, the lengths they went to, the planning, the whole process just to get the team. We had 3 things in mind: get our team over there safely, get them to the starting line, and get them back home safely to their family and friends. And to actually sit there now and say, wow, we did it. And there was every reason not to. So as you can hear, I'm still really humbled, I suppose, at just what happened. They were amazing games. And as you said earlier, Ian, the one thing I did want to say today, we will forever be grateful to the people of Japan, to the Japanese government, both the national government and the metropolitan Tokyo, and the IOC and IPC. You know, I can't believe they did it. And not only did they deliver the games, they delivered them something special, which they promised. So it was just a really special moment in time.
We had our chef de mission, I think, made the quote. If I'm taking it out of context, you'll excuse me, but we made the comment was essentially, Japan's the only country in the world that would have or could have. I'm terribly sorry. Who would have or could have pulled it off. Fiona, one of the other quotes was a lot along the lines of, these are pure elite athletes who happen to have a disability, Sophie Pascoe being one of them. How do you encapsulate your time with the New Zealand team? I had a wonderful time being able to spend a bit of time with your gang at the Shinagawa and the cycling crew. They certainly know how to have a good time when a good time is to be had. How do you bring it into just a couple of words?
Well, I guess to sum up Tokyo in one word, the whole experience was pride. It's a word that I don't say a lot, and yet the respect for our Paralympians who went to Tokyo firstly in the face of massive disruptions and delays caused by COVID. I think, you know, for me, each and every Paralympian was a winner before they even got there and took to the stage and took to the field of play. They had prepared in the face of diversity. They had amended their plans. For us, the day before our team was due to depart, they went into lockdown. It's like, what does it mean for us now? We managed to work with government to get them all there. So for us, seeing and knowing that we provided an environment, and what became for us really proud, also use that pride, a safe environment for our Paralympians to compete and demonstrate and be there and perform to their very best. We were really proud of that as a nation.
And so you should be. I mean, Lynn and Fiona, I'll ask you this question both separately and together at the same time. It was like a Paralympics like no other. I had never been to a Paralympics before. I must admit, and Lynn, I'm sure you know this, but you know, I come from the disability world with having a son with an intellectual disability. So people ask me if, you know, what it really meant to me. As Lynn alluded to, the first 3 days was really quite hard for me to get my head around it. I found myself finding a spot to actually have a little tear because of just everything that I was seeing around me and how the village was. Fiona and Lynn, I'll start with Fiona. I know from our perspective, the COVID protocols were well and truly way and beyond what TOCOG had actually required there of us. And we were able to actually, you know, basically pivot on a dime to whatever challenges were there. What was those challenges like for your team, and how did they overcome them? Well,
I think Australia and New Zealand both went in as nations into the Games with a very different perspective of what COVID meant. We were both two nations that fortunately hadn't had high levels of COVID within our nations, and therefore our appreciation of being COVID-free was, I think, quite different to quite a lot of nations going into that environment for a start. So yeah, there was a huge preparation and lens with regards to ensuring a safe environment. The mantra that Lynn had previously said around getting our athletes firstly to Tokyo, but importantly safely back from Tokyo, in everything and all the decision making during the Games to ensure that that goal was achieved became certainly, and Lynn will probably agree, first and foremost front to our minds, as well as supporting our athletes to perform in the field of play. But if they weren't doing the COVID related protocols, that would have been a key indicator to them potentially not even getting to the start line. And so that was our key priority throughout the Games, whilst also trying to, and this is what was really, I guess, balance within the Tokyo environment compared to previous Games, was keeping the camaraderie of the team high and the support networks across the team, whilst trying to maintain sport bubbles and trying to find unique ways to engage with team members, to still have fun, because that's what it's about too. And for some, it will be their only ever experience of a Paralympic Games. And they've got no other reference point for some of what a Paralympic Games is. And so for those athletes that have been to previous Games, yeah, it would have been quite different. But for those, and we had 18 debutants out of 29, so more than half of our team were first-time Paralympians. They had nothing to compare it against. This is just what it is. But you know, I felt that they missed out on so much. You know, couldn't just wander to the shop when they wanted to, couldn't stand around and chat around in the dining hall like they would usually do with other nations, and the ability to go and utilize the village as if it's the whole village as their home. They had just the New Zealand house. In our perspective, it would have been the same with the Australian accommodation as their base, and they're to and from the competitions. For some, they also didn't go and support other teams unless they'd finished their competitions as well, but that's normally a really big part of it, you know, that from a team culture perspective, that other sports support other sports, but you know, that was minimized this time, as well as also not having family and friends there as well to celebrate and join in the successes. So yeah, it was a wee bit different, but we had to think about unique or different ways of overcoming some of those challenges to provide what we wanted, an overall really enjoyable and successful experience in Tokyo.
I know from a personal perspective, as I said before, I really came out of the games and having a different attitude to really appreciating what I have and not worrying about what I don't have. And that was one of the things that really hit home for me. Lynn, if you don't mind me being just a little bit crass, in our environment, in our accommodation, the daily collection of tubes of spit became almost a funny game each morning as we were getting our COVID tests every single day. On that COVID thing, how do you feel now that you've got a chance to look back at everything that we did? And not only, I remember whilst we were there that day when we did have to, literally change accommodation of the entire place because of the challenges we faced.
Yeah, no, look, and I think Fiona was right. We were these two little countries off the bottom end of the earth, as our former Prime Minister used to say, in a far more crass way. But we were protected, weren't we, Fiona? And we'd sit in, meetings with our Five Eyes partners and we're complaining because we might have had, 30 cases that day. And those were a bit of a reality check going in, I think, that saying, wow, we're going to have to make sure we handle this in the way appropriate for our situation coming from Australia. We went really hard on the COVID. We had fantastic advice. We have two brilliant doctors, Dr. Rachel Harris, who is our CMO, Chief Medical Officer, but she was already committed to going with the Olympics water polo team, and she's got a young family. So for her to go and do both, to stay for Paralympics, would have just been 3 months out of her life, which she couldn't take. So it worked out really well for us because she got to go over early, give us all the insights from what she'd seen by being on the ground, and I think she got out of quarantine just in time to be our triage person, if you want, at home. So if anyone had any questions from overseas or our athletes' families could call Rach back here. We had Philippa Inge, who's a rock star as well, and she's currently away with our women's cricket team, so she's right at the elite of chief medical officers in Australia, and she was our one on the ground. And then we had this David Heslop, who had instituted he was the architect of the NRL bubble in Australia, the first national sporting code to get back, and still, fingers crossed, hasn't had an infection. And they all said to us, there will be COVID in Japan, there will be COVID in the village. And at that stage, we had no idea where we'd be in vaccinations when we first started that planning, 12, 18 months out. And so they said, you have to go hard. And David, as our advisor to the board, his risk advice I'm happy for you to go because Japan is a, really developed nation, but I'm only happy for you to go under these criteria. So from day one, we made it a very different experience. Our athletes we created our own Australia bubble. So even before they got on the plane in Australia, we had literally 2 weeks of a bubble at home. Some of them were in training bubbles with their teams, but somehow the athletes with higher needs had to have their own personalised, customised bubbles at home, where we really made certain that they weren't going to places that, as Fiona said, could have potentially impacted them, not even getting on the plane. We know there were a couple of athletes from America who tested positive at the airport, couldn't even get on the plane. And a few of them were traditional historical results and not in the system now, but that actually prevented them competing. So we basically, from woe to go, we kept our bubble as sacrosanct as we can. And that meant probably the 2 hard calls we made vaccinations mandatory. And, whatever the issues were around it, we said, look, we're not telling you, to change your philosophies if you really believe that you can't be vaccinated. However, if you want to come on our team in 2021 to Tokyo, you have to be vaccinated. And that is to protect, on all the medical advice, to protect not just our team, our staff and everyone else. So we were very clear that had to happen. If there was an extraneous circumstance, and there were a couple, we would sit down and discuss that with their own personal expert and medical opinions and work through it. But in the main, you had to go over there. In the village, we did not let you go to the dining hall. Now, that in itself, that was probably one of the hardest things, I think, for our athletes, because as Fiona said, that's the place they love to go. They work so hard. They're away from, their best friends in other teams. That every 4 years being in the dining hall is something that they really look forward to. So getting past that was hard, but I think in the main, the athletes accepted that we were doing everything for them. But what it meant was that little Paralympics Australia, who have a business of about 30, 40 people, we literally became an in-house restaurant. So Peter, you were very much a part of this beforehand, and our nutritionists sat with Peter, sat with all of our athletes. We couldn't customise everything for them because athletes are pretty fussy beasts, as we know. But, you know, certain conditions, you know, gluten-free, you know, dairy-free, etc., we accommodated. And literally we provided a team of 350, were fed 3 meals every day for nearly 3 weeks. We also had, we called it, or those Aussies out there will understand and remember this, the tuck shop. We called it the PA tuck shop, where they had snacks that they could come in and munch on all day. Now, I would walk into our kitchen and see the doctor that I mentioned earlier, Pip, you know, one of the smartest ladies in Australia, is wrapping egg wraps because everybody pitched in because it was hard. You know, we thought we had it all planned, but we forgot that little difference between voltage in Japan and Australia. So when we get there, we couldn't heat things up quite the way we used to had planned. So it didn't matter what happened, our team just handled it. But all within this strict confines of the Paralympics COVID bubble, Paralympics Australia COVID bubble. So it was a really different games for them. But what we found, which was a really beautiful bonus, because as Fiona said, you do get team centrics within the teams, and in a big team like that, in previous games, you go in and see swimming in the corner, rowing over here. I started to see that there was migration and cross-pollination, if you like, that I would look at a group and see there were 6 different sports. And they were actually taking the time to sit with her because they couldn't go anywhere other than our house that we had. So there were the adaptations that the athletes did from what they would have wanted to get into was amazing. And out of that, we've got some really nice camaraderie and culture bonuses as well. So it was a huge beast. There wasn't one food poisoning incident, I should say. I'm probably as proud of that as I am of no COVID. And that was it. We had no COVID. We had no disruption to turning up. There was a situation where one of our teams, so of course more people were deemed a close contact, but clearly not a close contact because they were still allowed to compete. So as the games were going on, TOCOG were adapting those rules. But we then had to move them quickly. It was either move them out to another hotel or we thought, no, hang on, we can get them on level 10, move everyone else out, but make sure that level 10 was a bubble within our bubble, so to speak. So again, whatever happened, they just adapted. And I think there's some really beautiful, profound, lasting benefits for us going forward.
Speaking of challenges and highlights, and Fiona, I'm going to give you a moment just to chat to think about that. Lynn, I've got to tell you that was exactly that. I was asked last night during the webinar what was the biggest challenge, and 900 meals a day for incredibly fussy, not just fussy eaters, but we had 2 kitchens running. The deputy chef de mission, myself, and the sports nutritionist, not only could we just go to a catering company in Tokyo and sort of say, can you do us some meals? Because bento boxes are part of the furniture in Japan, as part of the culture, etc. But they had to be athlete driven and they had to be for the athlete. So we were very lucky to be able to find a supplier there that had 2 kitchens running, one for the allergies and one for the non-allergies. And that was the one that made me lose the most of the sleep each time. And as I walked past the sports nutritionist every day, I only started to relax in the 2nd week. But I walk past the sports nutritionist every day going, how am I going? How are we going? How are we going? Because those of you in the ANZCCJ who know your business with Japan, is that everything happens in Japan with the go-between person. And if something goes wrong, that go-between person is the one responsible. So giving you that little bit of moment to think about it, Fiona, challenges and highlights, I suppose. And I suppose they can both sometimes be the same thing. But what are your thoughts?
Highlights was definitely having the opportunity to see our athletes perform. I was the only one from New Zealand, along with my chair from Paralympics New Zealand, flying the flags. So that was a highlight, to be able to in some way represent so many other people back here in New Zealand that were not able to be there. And what I did commit to this time was my daily newsletter to all family and friends, and I just shared with them a little insights, what was happening on a daily basis, inside the village, outside the village, the COVID testing procedures, highlights. Shared with them what I really. Another highlight was the word omotenashi. The hospitality of the Japanese just was so warming. We have the pleasure of having support volunteers to help us on a daily basis to get around. And oh my goodness, I got bento boxes delivered one day and I got matchbox cars delivered the next, because they knew we couldn't go out, and for my kids to bring back to my kids. So every day would be a build on where they'd just try and find out a little bit more information about yourself or your family. And then all of a sudden, you'd turn up with these beautifully wrapped
Yes.
gifts. And the generosity I felt was just huge from the Japanese and certainly the volunteers. So that was a real highlight, and that was really warming in the circumstances. We were really thrilled, like Lynn, with the uptake of the Paralympics back here in New Zealand through media. And we had 1.8 million New Zealanders tuning in to watch the Paralympics, and it was assisted by heading into lockdown, but also meant that people that wouldn't normally have been home during those times actually tuned in. And so what we saw was a real convert of different people than the normal viewership of the Paralympics, and much wider. And now then they were like, oh, I didn't know, so many good stories that came with people having witnessed Paralympic sport for the first time. And then the final highlight would be the number of people back in New Zealand with a disability that, through having seen the Paralympics, have now registered their interest to participate in a sport. And there was a 400% increase of registrations through the Paralympics New Zealand site with people registered. Now that's awesome, because that's part of what we do at Paralympics New Zealand, is in getting people more active. So getting more people with a disability active in New Zealand. And some may choose to one day follow the footsteps of our Paralympians, and some may not. But you know that through their participation in sport that you're having an impact and you're making an impact. So that was a real highlight. Challenges, there were a few. We didn't attend the opening and closing ceremony. So for similar to Lynn, with regards to the dining hall experience and the engagement there, that was a real challenge for us as a nation to decide not to go there. But then, we also felt that to put people in an environment whereby it was an enhanced, in our view, opportunity to be closer to other people than we needed to. So certainly in the first, before even competing, was not a risk that we wanted to take. The things that we needed to think about with making that decision is if someone did get COVID and someone needed to stay behind even after the closing ceremony, as we didn't have assurance around when we might get an MIQ slot. So again, it was different to what other nations experienced. The opening ceremony and not attending the opening ceremony, and also decision to not attend the closing ceremony, would have been, a challenge.
As I said last night, I was interviewed and I had too many highlights. But Lynn, we had so much help from our friends in Japan, including before we even got there, with the amount of work that sort of Japan Airlines and ANA did for us when we couldn't use the charter flights for our team, etc. And, we stayed in the same place, etc. It was hard. Every night it was coming back and going, did you see what happened today? Did you see that what Grant did? What things like Channel 7, how they've got 50% of their commentary team, and it's all this sort of stuff. It was endless conversation about those things, Lynn. And, what was really the highlights and challenges for yourself?
Oh, look, I think the challenge certainly for me was managing our staff, probably more than I say staff. You, Petty, all of our team that were on the support staff.
Me.
Everyone was working so hard and so long hours, and we always put in so much effort to make sure the athletes are okay, but I think I was really conscious of that, and I'm seeing now that everyone is still whacked. It took so much more out of everyone than in a normal thing, and I think part of that was because we usually go in reasonably rested. It's going to be frenetic. You're only going to get 4 hours sleep a night, but you go in and try and have a break 3 or 4 months. Well, we didn't have that break, and so now we've instituted policies around mandatory recovery leave, but a formula. If you're away for 2 weeks, you get 10 days, whatever it might be. But we're really conscious of trying to help that. We knew there wasn't a lot we could do because the event just had to happen, but trying to make it forward. So that was something that I'm really looking into hard now to say, how can we get better next time? In terms of probably one of the highlights, I think I didn't realise the depth of it till I got home, and it's what Fiona said. It was just that the real impact we had on our home people. More Australians than ever. It took Australia's Paralympic team into their homes through Channel 7, but into their hearts. And that was another thing that I wasn't ready for with our staff. Our staff at home got really drowned because we had 10,400 pen pal letters from the schools program we did. We had to get, every one of them had to be PDF'd and sent over. We had the state government did a beautiful promotion with the Olympics and Paralympics in New South Wales. We had to find 179 headshots of a certain qualities to go on the Opera House when the New South Wales government had a welcome home. That normally is great in a normal year, but team processing in COVID year meant we didn't get the updated latest headshots in the same format. So my EA literally had to scrounge to find 179 photos. So the success blew me away. It caused a lot of heartache and long hours, etc. But the numbers, I think we had like 8 million people watching through Channel 7. As I said, 10,400 pen pal letters, 1,100 teachers signed up. Government, we have a program where once our team's selected, we write to the individual politician where every athlete comes from. In Rio, we probably only got 2 or 3 that came back. Over 100 politicians now wanted to meet them, talk with them, be interviewed with them. So it's just that groundswell of awareness. And part of that, that's probably the thing I'm most proud of, because post Rio, I remember saying Rio was my first games, and I'm a marketer, a commercial background, and I just said, there is an appetite for this. We just have to get the platform. We just have to give them an opportunity to be seen. And so we worked really hard on that for the last 5 years in terms of our relationship with Channel 7, getting the athletes to be more well known. And so for the opportunity to come, we were ready. We called it a virtual home games because the same time zone, so we knew that would work well. COVID obviously worked even better for us. And to see that impact now, we put a fundraising promotion on. We made 2.4 million seats. I knew it would do really well because the campaign was around, you can't be there, at least buy a seat and let the athletes know that you're there. So I knew intuitively that would work, but 2.4 more than quadrupled the amount that I was prepared to put in the budget anyway for it all. So I think it was just those layer upon layer that when we come home, and even the other night, Maddie de Rosario came out to see me. I live in Cronulla, and just went down to dinner. It was second day out of Freedom Day had been the day before we went to dinner. She got recognised everywhere we went, and I was really proud of that, because I think we worked hard for that, and she deserves every bit of recognition that she's getting. So I think that's the success of the Games for me, is I know it's a permanent step change, and with 2032 in 10 years, we have now something even better to build on. And really, I want us to leave the legacy now. I don't want the legacy to be in 2032 and beyond. We're calling it a 10 plus 10 year runway to actually really get a really good legacy for people with the sport and our social inclusion in Australia, as much as disability sport.
I think from a Japanese perspective, that's also so important, because I remember my first trip to Japan was 1985, and the word barrier free didn't exist in those days, which is the Japanese word for accessible. And, that's to see not only the Channel 7 coverage, but also see the NHK coverage, which I spent a lot of time watching. It was incredible to see just how much of inclusion and diversity that have been embraced by the Japanese people, not only in the media, but also in the commercial world. You did steal my thunder there, Lynn, because I was just about to talk. I was part of that team when we first sat down and started talking about the fundraising activity and what we could do with Channel 7. And we ended up obviously on the virtual seat one. And sorry, Fiona, to be a little bit Australia-centric here, but it was, we sat down, and as I said, we would have been doing backflips if we'd got $500,000. And I'm pretty sure that was, and correct me if I'm wrong, I'm pretty sure that was the number that was in the budget. But when we were sitting there each day getting live updates, and we ended up on $2.396 million, it was just, the hair, whatever hair I had, it was standing up on my head. So, it was just an incredible thing. And especially when we talked about the runway, the 10-year runway into 2032. And we know now, and you talk about participation, Fiona, we now know that, we've got 11 and 12-year-olds in both of our countries who are seeing the Maddies, who are seeing the Dylans, who are seeing the Sophies, and they're going, wow, Brisbane, I can be there, I can do that. And that's, that transcends everything else that we're talking about. I suppose we're going to have a few questions. I'm going to throw over to Ian very shortly soon, but I will finish off, as we do, we finish off with the last night in the village. And we talk about how many highlights that we had there. So there are things which we have, things that happened in the village on the last night, which we have a 7-year moratorium on those stories. So unfortunately, we aren't able to bring those to your attention. But I knew I was working with a CEO who's what I call as the card-carrying member of the PLU, which is people like us. I had a personal highlight. of the last night when the karaoke machine was going. And Lynn made reference to the Australian team being the mob and the teamwork. So many of these sports really only come together in this period of whether it be Commonwealth Games or Paralympic Games. And that's the time. And that mob came together. And it was really interesting to see from an outsider's point of view. Many times I said to them, thank you for having me at your games. But on the last night, that teamwork was all about, so we were having a lot of fun. Granted, the karaoke machine was warming up, and over in the corner, I saw our boccia team, and as you know, boccia being the highest needs in the disability and impairment world, all players in an electric wheelchair. And I said, hang on a second, this is not right. The rest of the team is in there and they're having fun with karaoke, etc. And it's just starting to warm up. And I walked over and I said to Spencer and Dan Michelle and names Steph.
Jamison.
And I said, guys, favorite song, what is it? Let's go. Let's go. And they said, being young kids, and so they said, no, we're fine. And I walked away 20 meters, and I said, I had that conversation with myself. I said, nah, that's not good enough. You're coming with me. And sure enough, we walked into the karaoke room. We split the waters. Said, look out, everybody! Here comes boccia. And they brought the house down. I looked across at Lynn, and she gave me a wink, and she said, "Good job. That's teamwork." So it's all about that teamwork. And if you're just indulging me at the moment, I know. So I'm sorry about that. Ian, I'm going to throw to you for a couple of questions and then some comments from Lynn and Fiona on any of the points that I may not have covered. But it's been an incredible insight so far into what an event I will never, ever forget.
Absolutely agree, Peter, and thank you very much. I've just probably got, from a logistic point of view, the learnings that you've achieved through Tokyo. Would you change anything for the upcoming Beijing Winter Olympic Games? I know that your teams are going to be much smaller, but is there anything you would change from those learnings in Tokyo, considering the COVID-19 is still happening?
From my point of view, no. We've got the plan, we've got the model, it's been tried and tested. We're reviewing things now, and there'll be tweaks that we make along the way. But no, as Fiona said before, safety comes first. Normally when you start down your planning, the first objective is always performance. This time around it was safety then performance, and that hasn't gone away, not yet.
That's fantastic. And from you, Fiona, same thing, I would assume?
Yeah, we'll keep those plans the same. I guess reviewing some of the debriefs that are coming through is how do you create, possibly more of a balance. You still want to get the information, but you don't want everything to be focused on COVID. We know COVID's here, it's going to be here for a little longer. And how do you focus upon, just tipping that slightly? That would be a learning for me, and perhaps what we would do differently. We were all learning through this time, and we'll take those learnings, and that would be one, is how we find a bit more balance between the safety, but also, keeping very mindful of the performance aspects that are required as part of the decision making.
Just another question on the athletes. Look, from an athlete's perspective, they're always under stress, especially competing at this level, okay? They're coming to the games, they have all these other additional stresses, like they can't go to the hall, they can't go to the opening ceremony, they can't go and meet everyone. What sort of measures did you put in place to try and help that? Was there anything additional you tried to implement to try and alleviate that issue? I mean, games rooms, for example, or do something like this. You know, I mean, was there anything you actually did in the village in addition to trying to?
We had 2 phases of that. Obviously, 3 leading in. It's just mandatory now that everyone has a lot of sports psych work. So I think we had 1 or 2 more on the team because of the COVID changes to the village. We ended up, while we were only in the one village, it was only ours. We thought we were sharing with other countries. So we were able to take over, still had the level 10 limit, I think, but we were able to take over and make, as I said, the tuck shop rooms, PA tuck shop was a great area for people to just go and collaborate and have a bit of fun. And we were able to make a few breakout lounges and things along the way. We had lots of home memorabilia around the walls. So that was an improvement, but especially when we came home, we had done a lot of work in advance with the Institute of Sport in Australia and the Australian Olympic Committee, and we had a very robust, really great quarantine program ready, because that's all the research we'd got from the other sports like the NRL, AFL cricket, that you're fine on quarantine, you're hyped or you're fine to get over the games, but the hump comes after day 5, I think it is, something around that. So we took a lot of learnings and built some really cool programs. We had this one guy, Andy, can't think of his last name, an Aussie guy who'd been he was stuck with a few down in Antarctica just after the COVID had struck, and what was supposed to be only a 3-month trip expedition turned into being 12 months, and so he took it. It was very similar actually in many ways to what we had to do with our with COVID planning. So we had him in, we had a wine and tasting night, we had yoga every day, but just allowing something on a program that you could log into. There was reading material if you wanted, that you could do some education. So it was just, if you're going to have some challenges and we're really conscious of mental health, here's a program that hopefully gives you another option to at least go. I was so busy I hardly got the chance to use it. I would have loved to have been bored in quarantine, but it didn't happen.
You, Fiona, anything in particular, or?
Yeah, it started really early on. So we didn't make a final decision around not attending the opening ceremony until all the information was made available to us. But then the day before, when we made the decision, I was like, okay, what are we going to do here? So we ensured that we had to get TVs in everyone's rooms so they could watch it. So all of a sudden, our rate card bill went of ensuring that at least if we're not going, people can still experience it and watch it, albeit probably in Japanese commentary, right? So that is interesting. But what we did is we did bring the team together, and they're all the different bubbles, and do our own wee ceremony prior to on the same night, so that that sense of team was really highlighted through that moment. So yeah, we did moments like that throughout, just to keep the team connected. And in advance, I guess we underestimated just the increased level of communication in advance to prepare our people, not just our athletes, but also our support staff, with the expectations around what they might expect in the journey within Tokyo. And goodness, I think I really underestimated the amount of communications between, for us, High Performance Sport New Zealand, our member sports, and then our people within the team, and being able to answer all the questions in advance when we were also working with the information that we had available at the time from the organising committee. We always have the answers, but we certainly, I think, we're very clear if we didn't have the answers, and certainly try to take people on that journey in advance of what it would look like, which was important from an expectations perspective.
Yep.
Ian, can I just, Fiona, you just reminded me one, and I should have brought it up even as a highlight. We too were really conscious because of not marching in either ceremony, particularly the opening one. We had our cycling sub-site. So we had the cycling team because it was out of Izu, so a couple of hours out of Tokyo. And Kate, our chef de mission in Australia, she said to me, Lynn, I'm really worried that they're going to be isolated and not feel part of it. So she said, I'm sending you up on the night before. So I went up there, had the afternoon with them. We did our own opening ceremony in the beautiful gardens of the hotel we stayed at. Got dressed up, which was really stinking hot in all our RM Williams gear. Got out of it as soon as we came back in, but had dinner with them that night, had a few drinks. We watched the ceremony live with the Channel 7 thing. And that to me, and then the very next day, go to the velodrome before I come back, and we had 2 world records and a goal before I'd even got in the car to come back. So it could not have been a more special moment to start the games on. But I feel like it also, the cycling, so when the cycling came back to Shinagawa, Pete with us on the last couple of nights, it was like they were old friends. And we'd only really engaged with them, closely. I knew most of them, but not all of them. But when they came to Shinagawa, we sat down and had a drink or two on one of the nights. I thought that was something really special. And I'm really pleased that Kate had suggested it, because I wasn't going to the opening ceremony. And so for me, just to be there with one of our teams who could have been isolated was special.
Excellent. I'm sure.
And may I say, Ian, that Lynn had a very accomplished driver out to Izu on that.
Who was that, Peter?
I wanted to very quickly, if I may interject, just on the legacy side of things. And Fiona, this and Lynn, sort of I suppose, question without notice, but all of the attendees today's webinar are all members of the chamber, obviously, and they're very heavily involved with the bilateral relationship between Australia and Japan, and also Japan and New Zealand. There's a lot happening in that space at the moment, especially in the commercial space. I know I'm now working a little bit with the Australia-Japan Foundation and what we can do for the relationship between Australia and New Zealand on the back of the Olympics and the Paralympics. And part of my business plan with the AJF is to include, and I spoke to Lynn briefly about this at the airport, is to include Paralympics in that brief about how we can actually get more exchange between the two countries. From your perspective, is there something that companies can do to be involved a little bit with if they've got members of the chamber who can be a part of a legacy around the Paralympic Games, and maybe what is it that they may have? And if it's nothing at this point in time, that's very understandable.
Yeah, well, for us, anyone can go to the Paralympics New Zealand website. We've actually got an ad for sale. I don't know if you've seen it, but we work with Saatchi and Saatchi, and we've got an ad for sale whereby any organisation can seek to purchase it and utilise it and rebrand it and work with us on it. We did it to raise the increase of Paralympians being utilised by companies and organisations as ambassadors and brand ambassadors for their organisations. So that was the reason we did it. And so I think there's always an opportunity, I think, to seek how we can further support often relatively and equitably less funded Paralympians to Olympians with regards to supporting them on their careers paths, many of which 70% of our team work or study, so we're always looking at ways to do that, to better support our Paralympians and their aspirations, as well as our own organisation goals and also Lynn's organisation's goals around shifting and changing perceptions of disability across our nations and working to create a more inclusive and New Zealand and Australia through the work that we do. So they are core values of both organisations with regards to shifting perceptions and attitudes towards disabled people and making for a more inclusive society through the Paralympic movement. So definitely there's opportunities if there's people on this call interested in embarking and supporting either Paralympics Australia or Paralympics New Zealand. And whilst we also partner to support your endeavours with regards to further diversity and inclusion and aspects that are important within your changing organisations or companies as well.
Yeah, I agree with that, Fiona. What I would like to say to everyone here today, you know, whether it's Japan Paralympic Committee or our two here, I think that the best legacy that I would love to see from corporates is to actually look at how can you look inside your own organisations. How are you doing your diversity and inclusion play? I'm quite passionate about that because I've just come out of, obviously, earlier this year when we were announced with Brisbane will be the host of the 2032 Paralympic and Olympic Games. We wrote a beautiful, when I say we, Paralympics Australia, wrote what I believe is a really beautiful vision for the Paralympic Games in Australia and what the legacy we want. So we want 500,000 more people with a disability to actually be more active by 2032. We know that some will rise to the top and want to compete in sport, but we also know by being more active has a fantastic positive impact on the economy in Australia. So for me, I'm really passionate about companies just looking within and say, how can you make your business, you know, be more amenable and more in line, I suppose, with the drive for diversity and inclusion. And when you can see where changes can be made, you know, there's certainly opportunities, whether, again, as I said, Japan, NPC or ours, to say, well, how can I use, if it's an athlete or a program or whatever. We do a great thing called a Para Tough Cup. We've hardly been able to do any because of COVID. But essentially, Harvey Norman, one of our big retailers, bought a Para Tough Cup. They had their teams from finance, marketing, and they compete against each other across 4 or 5 unique Paralympic sports. And they, you know, obviously gave us money for that. But that was a really good team building and D&I play. So I think there's loads of programs and assets that we would have. But my first starting point would be to really encourage everybody to, as I said, take up the diversity and inclusion mantra more within your own businesses. And thank you for everything that you have done, and even just these 2 opportunities for Fiona and I get together. We usually see each other during the games, and I only saw her from a distance. I wasn't supposed to go near. I might have got a bit close at one stage, but don't tell my chef to mission. But it's been great to actually keep in touch again, although we've got an early morning call tomorrow, haven't we, Fiona? With the Five Eyes, so we'll catch up twice in 24 hours. But yeah, Ian and Peter and everyone here today from the chamber, thank you so much. We really appreciate it, because even that alone is giving more voice to our message of diversity and inclusion.
And that's exactly what we want to try to achieve and try and help you in every way possible. Even though we're in Japan, we want to try and help, you know, so, and whatever we can do, we will try. And from a chamber, we're happy to do that as well. So if you can think of anything, we're happy to get on board and discuss it and see where we can help both of you, okay? Which is massively important. So look, I might just finish it there. I mean, again, on behalf of the chamber, we thank you both, and also Peter, Fiona, Lynn. This is fantastic. Your honest insightfulness of the games, the stories, the things that happened was incredible. You know, so, but look, from our perspective, I'm sure which is really important is your staff that are behind the scenes. You know, they put so much time and effort and willingness to support this movement and also the athletes, and they deserve a very, very special thank you. You know, so. And again, on behalf of all of us, we wish you all the success and all the best planning for the Beijing Games coming up, and also to the Australian New Zealand athletes. So again, thank you very, very much for your time.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone, for joining.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Lynn. Thank you, Fiona, and thank you, Ian.
Thanks, guys.
Thanks, guys.
Ciao.